and the frozen promise. You've put your phone down, finally. The screen goes dark, and there you are, lying in the familiar darkness of your bedroom, feeling the weight you carry settling into your chest like sediment in still water. Your body knows it's time to rest, but your mind is still there, isn't it? Still calculating, still planning, still carrying tomorrow's burdens tonight. I want to take you somewhere else, somewhere far from the glow of notifications and the endless scroll of obligations. I want to take you to a place where 28 souls found themselves facing the impossible and discovered something profound about what it means to endure. Picture this, if you will. October 1915, the Weddell Sea, Antarctica. Imagine the most complete silence you've ever experienced, then make it deeper. Imagine the most pristine white you've ever seen, then make it endless. Now imagine a single ship, dark against that infinite canvas of ice and snow, held fast in nature's grip like a fly in amber. The ship is called Endurance, and at this moment she represents both the greatest hope and the greatest fear of every person aboard her. Her captain, Ernest Shackleton, stands on the deck in the Antarctic morning, his breath forming small clouds in the -30 air. He's 41 years old, though the polar winds have etched lines around his eyes that speak of older wisdom. Like you, he knows what it means to carry the weight of others' trust. Like you, he understands the particular burden of being responsible not just for a vision, but for the people who've chosen to follow it. The Endurance has been locked in the ice for nearly 2 months now. What began as a temporary inconvenience, a brief delay in their grand expedition to cross the Antarctic continent, has become something else entirely. The ice, which seemed so beautiful when they first encountered it, has revealed its true nature. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't compromise. It simply holds. But here's what strikes me about this moment, and why I think it might speak to you tonight. Despite everything, despite being trapped hundreds of miles from civilization, despite facing the onset of the Antarctic winter, despite watching their carefully laid plans crumble like autumn leaves, there is still hope aboard the Endurance, not the naive hope of those who haven't faced real adversity. This is something deeper. This is the hope of people who understand that what you're building isn't always what you end up creating. Shackleton moves through the ship with the measured pace of a leader who has learned to conserve energy for what matters. His footsteps echo softly against the wooden decks as he makes his morning rounds. This ritual, this simple act of being present with his crew, has become more important than any grand speech or dramatic gesture. In the forecastle, he finds the sailors already awake. These are practical men, most of them. They've signed on for adventure, yes, but they've also signed on for wages to send home to families in distant ports. Now, watching the ice press against the ship's hull with the slow, inexorable patience of geological time, they're beginning to understand that this expedition will test more than their seamanship. Yet they're adapting. Humans always do, don't they? They've established routines, small anchors of normalcy in an increasingly uncertain world. The cook, Charles Green, still rises before dawn to prepare breakfast, his movements practiced and sure even as the ship creaks and groans around him. The scientists continue their observations, their measurements, their careful documentation of this alien world they've found themselves in. There's something beautiful about this insistence on continuing the work, even when the circumstances have fundamentally changed. It reminds me of you, actually. How you keep showing up, keep building, keep leading, even when the ground beneath you feels less than solid. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, joins Shackleton on deck. Worsley is a different sort of man than his leader. Where Shackleton is broad and solid, Worsley is lean and quick. His eyes hold the particular alertness of someone who has spent his life reading the subtle messages that water and weather send to those who know how to listen. The pressure's increasing, Worsley says quietly. It's not a question. Both men can feel it. A subtle vibration through the ship's timbers, a sense of forces gathering like storm clouds on a summer afternoon. Shackleton nods. He's been feeling it too. The ice isn't content to simply hold them. It's alive in its way. Breathing, shifting, testing the strength of their wooden walls with the patience of something that has been here for millennia and will be here long after they're gone. But watch what Shackleton does with this information. He doesn't panic. He doesn't gather the crew for urgent meetings or desperate contingency planning. Instead, he simply acknowledges it, files it away, adds it to the growing collection of facts that will inform his decisions in the days to come. This is leadership, isn't it? Not the theatrical kind that makes for good stories, but the quiet kind that keeps people alive. The kind that understands that your crew, your team, your family, your investors, they're watching you not for signs of certainty, but for signs of steadiness. As the morning progresses, the ship comes alive with activity. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, emerges from below decks with the easy confidence of a man who has followed Shackleton through previous impossibilities. Wild is Yorkshire-born, solid as the stone walls of his homeland, with a gift for making the extraordinary seem merely challenging rather than catastrophic. He's been checking the stores, calculating and recalculating their supplies against various scenarios. It's the kind of work that keeps hands busy and minds focused on solvable problems. There's wisdom in this approach, in finding the practical tasks that need doing even when the larger situation feels beyond control. The crew gathers for breakfast in the wardroom, their voices creating a warm bubble of human sound in the vast Antarctic silence. They talk about small things, the quality of their sleep, the behavior of the sled dogs, plans for the day's work. These conversations might seem trivial to an outside observer, but they serve a crucial purpose. They're threads in the fabric that holds a group together when external circumstances threaten to pull everything apart. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist and banjo player, provides entertainment with both his weather observations and his music. There's something profound about the presence of music in a place like this. It serves no practical purpose, contributes nothing to their survival in any measurable way. And yet it's essential. It reminds them that they're more than just biological machines focused on staying alive. They're human beings, capable of creating beauty even in the most unlikely circumstances. As you lie there tonight, feeling the weight of what you're building pressing against your chest, I want you to consider this. Shackleton and his crew didn't choose their circumstances. They set out to accomplish one thing and found themselves facing something entirely different. The expedition they planned, the crossing of Antarctica, the glory, the achievement, none of that was going to happen, not in the way they'd imagined. But something else was going to happen. Something that would test not their ability to execute a plan, but their capacity to adapt when all plans become irrelevant. Something that would reveal not whether they could achieve their original vision, but whether they could discover new forms of strength they didn't know they possessed. The afternoon brings work, always work. The crew tends to the dogs, magnificent creatures bred for this harsh environment, but still dependent on human care for their survival. There's something moving about watching these men, trapped in circumstances beyond their control, still taking responsibility for other living beings, still maintaining the routines of care and feeding and exercise that keep the pack healthy and ready for whatever might come. Shackleton moves among them, not directing so much as participating. He understands something that many leaders miss. That authority in extreme circumstances comes not from position, but from presence, from the willingness to share in both the mundane tasks and the uncertain future. The ship's photographer, Frank Hurley, captures these moments with his camera. Even here, even now, there's an understanding that what they're experiencing needs to be documented. Not just for history, but for themselves, as if the act of recording these days gives them weight and meaning beyond mere survival. The ice around them tells its own story. What appeared static to untrained eyes reveals itself to be in constant motion, grinding, shifting, building pressure that expresses itself in sudden cracks and groans that echo across the frozen landscape like the settling of some enormous house. The crew has learned to read these sounds, to distinguish between the normal complaints of ice under pressure and the more ominous notes that suggest something fundamental is changing. As evening approaches, though in this place the distinction between day and night becomes increasingly academic, the crew gathers again. Dinner, conversation, the simple rituals that mark human time in a place where natural time follows different rules. Shackleton sits among them, not at the head of some formal table, but as part of the circle. He listens more than he speaks, filing away the small concerns and observations that will inform his understanding of the crew's morale and readiness. This, too, is leadership, this careful attention to the human weather that matters more than any barometric reading. Tonight, as they settle into their bunks, each man carries his own version of the weight you know so well. The weight of uncertainty, of responsibility, of hopes that may not unfold as planned. Some of them have families at home, wives and children who are counting on their return. Others are young men for whom this expedition represents their first real test of character. All of them are beginning to understand that they're part of something larger and more demanding than they initially imagined. But here's what I find remarkable about this moment in their story. Despite everything, despite the ice, despite the growing realization that their situation is more serious than anyone initially understood, they haven't given up on what they're building. It's just that what they're building is changing, evolving, becoming something different from what they planned, but perhaps more important than what they originally envisioned. They're building resilience, they're building trust, they're building the kind of bonds that will be tested in ways they can't yet imagine. Most importantly, they're building the understanding that leadership, real leadership, isn't about having all the answers. It's about remaining steady while you figure out the questions. As the Endurance settles into another night held fast in the ice, her crew sleeping fitfully in their narrow bunks, the Antarctic wind whispers across the frozen landscape with promises and threats in equal measure. The ice continues its patient work, testing the strength of human ambition against the indifferent power of natural forces. But inside the ship, something else is being tested. Something less tangible but perhaps more durable. The capacity of human beings to adapt, to endure, to find meaning and purpose, even when their carefully laid plans encounter the immovable realities of a world that operates by its own rules. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve and resourcefulness. The ice will continue to tighten its grip, and the crew of the Endurance will continue to discover what they're truly made of. But that's tomorrow's story. Tonight they sleep, as you will sleep, held by the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply endure until morning. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership is to rest, to restore yourself so that you can face whatever comes next with clarity and strength. The ice holds them fast, yes, but they hold something too. Each other, their shared purpose, their quiet determination to see this through, whatever it becomes. In the vast silence of the Antarctic night, that might just be enough. Whispers in the ice. The ship speaks to them in the darkness, a language of wood and ice, of strain and endurance. Listen closely, and you'll hear it too. The deep groans that rise from the Endurance's belly as the ice shifts around her hull. These are not the sounds of destruction, not yet. They are the sounds of adaptation, of a vessel built for this very purpose, yielding just enough to survive. Harry McNish knows these sounds better than anyone. The ship's carpenter lies in his bunk, eyes closed but fully awake, his weathered hands resting on his chest as he listens to his floating workshop. Each creak tells him a story. This beam flexing under pressure, that joint working loose, the hull plates singing their thin song against the ice. For 43 years he has worked with wood, and wood has taught him patience. Wood bends before it breaks. Wood endures. The weight you carry, it speaks to you in the night too, doesn't it? Those sounds that only you can hear. The quiet hum of responsibility, the subtle shift in tone when something needs attention. Like McNish, you've learned to listen, to interpret the language of what you're building. You know which sounds mean danger and which simply mean change. The wind tonight carries voices from another world. It whistles through the rigging with an almost musical quality, a lonely song that seems to come from the very heart of Antarctica itself. The crew has grown accustomed to this soundtrack, the way it rises and falls like breathing, the way it sometimes drops to complete silence before returning with renewed force. Frank Wilde pulls his blanket closer and thinks of home, of English rain and the sound it makes against proper windows. But even homesickness has evolved here. It's become something gentler, less sharp. A warm ache rather than a cutting pain. The mind, like the ship, learns to flex rather than break. In the forecastle, the men sleep in shifts and stages. Some snore softly, their breathing mixing with the ship's own respiration. Others lie quiet, following their thoughts down familiar paths, calculations and worries, memories and plans. Tom Crean dreams of his farm in Kerry, but even in sleep his body remains alert to the ship's movements. This is how sailors learn to rest, never completely surrendering to unconsciousness, always keeping one ear open for the sounds that matter. The ice around them is not silent, despite what you might imagine. It murmurs and whispers, cracks and settles with sounds like distant thunder. Sometimes it screams, a sharp, sudden cry as pressure finds release somewhere in the vast white expanse. The first time they heard these ice screams, the younger men startled awake, hearts racing. Now they barely stir. The ear learns to distinguish between the sounds of normal movement and the sounds that require attention. This is wisdom you understand, isn't it? How experience teaches you which alarms deserve your immediate response and which are simply the natural sounds of something under pressure finding its way forward. McNish rises from his bunk and moves through the ship with the careful steps of a man who knows every board beneath his feet. His workshop, tucked into the forward hold, smells of wood shavings and linseed oil, familiar scents that ground him in purpose. By lamplight, he examines his tools, running his fingers over plane blades and chisel edges. These implements are extensions of himself now, and their condition matters more than he cares to admit. He thinks about the lifeboats secured on deck, 3 small vessels that represent both hope and acknowledgement of darker possibilities. They are well built, these boats, but they were never meant to carry 28 men across the Southern Ocean. Still, McNish tends to them with religious devotion. He checks their seams, tests their fittings, makes small improvements that might someday mean the difference between life and death. This is the carpenter's burden: to prepare for outcomes no one wants to discuss, to strengthen what might need to carry them all should the unthinkable become inevitable. It's a responsibility that sits heavy on his shoulders, but McNish has carried such weight before. Every ship's carpenter understands that their work is ultimately about survival, about creating structures that will hold when everything else gives way. You know this feeling, the quiet weight of being the one who must think ahead, who must prepare for contingencies that others prefer not to contemplate. It's a lonely kind of responsibility, but also a necessary one. Someone must tend to the boats. The galley holds its own particular warmth tonight. Charlie Green, the cook, moves between his stoves with practiced efficiency, preparing the late watch their meal. The smell of seal meat and ship's biscuit fills the air. Not appetizing by the standards of civilization, perhaps, but here it represents something more fundamental. Sustenance, continuation, the simple promise that there will be another meal tomorrow. Green works quietly, lost in the rhythm of preparation. His hands know this work so well that his mind is free to wander, to think about the men he feeds, their individual appetites and preferences. How Hurley always asks for extra tea, how the younger men still turn their noses up at the seal meat, how Shackleton eats whatever is put before him without comment or complaint. Feeding people. It's an act of faith, isn't it? A declaration that the future exists, that tomorrow will come, and bring with it the need for nourishment. In the galley's warm light, surrounded by the simple tools of his trade, Green performs this act of faith 3 times a day. He keeps them all anchored to the basic rhythms of human need. Above deck, the aurora australis paints the sky in sheets of green and gold. The night watchman. Tonight it's Bakewell, stands bundled against the cold, his breath forming clouds that dissipate quickly in the dry air. The beauty above him is almost overwhelming in its alien magnificence. These lights dance to music no human ear can hear, following patterns that seem both random and purposeful. Bakewell thinks about the folks back home who will never see such sights, who live their entire lives under ordinary skies. There's something both humbling and elevating about being witness to such raw beauty. It reminds him that the world is larger and stranger than any of them fully comprehend, that there are forces at work here beyond human understanding or control. But even in the face of such cosmic indifference, human routine continues. Bakewell checks the ship's position relative to the ice. He notes the wind direction. He listens for changes in the sounds around him. These small acts of attention and care, they matter precisely because the universe is so vast and uncaring. They are humanity's answer to the indifferent stars. The cold seeps through every layer of clothing, but Bakewell has learned to work with it rather than against it. He moves regularly to keep his blood flowing. He focuses on the warmth in his core rather than the numbness in his extremities. He has discovered what the Stoics knew, that suffering becomes bearable when you stop fighting its existence and simply endure. In the ship's library, really just a collection of books gathered in the wardroom, volumes wait patiently for tomorrow's readers. Browning and Tennyson, volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, technical manuals on navigation and meteorology. These books represent more than entertainment or education. They are connection to the world of ideas, to the accumulated wisdom of civilization. Tomorrow, someone will read aloud from Browning, while others listen and work on small tasks. The words will create a space that transcends their physical circumstances, a reminder that they are not just bodies struggling against the elements, but minds capable of beauty and reflection. Literature becomes a form of resistance against the reduction of human experience to mere survival. The ship settles into her night rhythm, that particular quality of rest that comes to vessels and crews who have learned to trust each other. The Endurance creaks and sighs, but these are the sounds of accommodation rather than distress. She holds her men safely while the ice holds her. It's a chain of trust that reaches from the smallest rivet to the largest decision. In this floating world, surrounded by a landscape that cares nothing for human ambition or fear, 28 men continue the simple, revolutionary act of taking care of each other. They tend to their tools and their duties. They share their warmth and their worries. They listen to the ice and the wind and the ship's wooden voice, learning to distinguish between the sounds of danger and the sounds of change. The weight you carry tonight, let it settle like the ship settles. Let it find its natural position, neither ignored nor obsessed over. Like McNish with his tools, like Green with his stove, like Bakewell under the dancing lights, tend to what needs tending, then trust in the larger structure to hold. The ice whispers its ancient secrets to those who know how to listen, and sometimes that's enough. Act, the rhythm of routine. The morning of November 2nd arrives with the same quiet persistence as all the others. No dramatic announcement, no sudden shift in the light, just the gradual awareness that another day has begun, measured not by clocks, but by the subtle changes in how the ice speaks around them. You know this feeling, the way routine becomes both anchor and lifeline when everything else feels uncertain. The way small, repeated actions create a framework that holds when larger structures seem to bend. Frank Wilde is always first to stir, not because he sets an alarm. There are no alarms here. But because leadership, real leadership, often means being the first to face what the day might bring. He moves through the ship with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that consistency in small things creates space for flexibility in large ones. The galley becomes the heart of their floating world. Charles Green, their cook, approaches each meal not as mere sustenance, but as an act of care made manifest. His hands work with ingredients that grow more precious each day, transforming seal meat and tinned provisions into something that nourishes more than just the body. Watch him work, the way he measures flour with the precision of a scientist and the intuition of an artist. The way he tends his stove, coaxing warmth and life from coal that must last longer than anyone originally planned. There's a meditation in this daily practice, a rhythm that speaks to something deeper than hunger. The aroma of fresh bread. Yes, fresh bread, even here, fills the cramped quarters. It carries with it the memory of home, of normalcy, of a world where bread comes from bakeries and warmth from radiators that never fail. But more than memory, it carries hope. The simple declaration that today, like yesterday, they will eat well. They will maintain the small dignities that separate survival from mere existence. Around the makeshift table, 28 men gather. Not because they must. Space is cramped. They could eat in shifts, scattered throughout the ship. But because Shackleton understands something about human nature that many leaders miss. That shared meals create shared purpose. That breaking bread together, literally breaking it, passing it hand to hand, builds bonds stronger than rope. Listen to their conversations, not the grand pronouncements or strategic discussions you might expect. Instead, the ordinary magic of human connection. Someone mentions a dog they had as a child, Another describes his sister's wedding, planned for spring. These aren't escapes from their reality. They're affirmations of it, reminders that they are more than their current circumstances. The weight you carry tonight, it too benefits from this kind of tending. Not the dramatic gestures or sweeping changes, but the quiet consistency of showing up, of creating routines that honor both the work and the person doing it. After breakfast, the ship transforms into a constellation of purposeful activity. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, makes his careful observations. Temperature, wind direction, barometric pressure, numbers that tell the story of their world with scientific precision. His instruments become extensions of his senses, helping him read the ice's moods like a farmer reads the sky. There's something profound in his daily practice, the way he records each measurement with the same care whether the day brings hope or hardship, the way he maintains faith in the future by continuing to gather information for a world that feels increasingly distant. His logbook becomes both record and prayer, a testament to the belief that these details matter, that someone, somewhere, will want to know what happened here. Meanwhile, Reginald James works with his surveying equipment, mapping their slow drift across the frozen sea. Each calculation tells them where they are, but more importantly, it tells them they are somewhere, that their position matters, that they remain connected to the larger world even when that world feels impossibly far away. You understand this need, don't you? The way tracking progress, even slow progress, even uncertain progress, creates a sense of forward movement when everything else feels static. The way measurement becomes its own form of hope. In another corner, Dr. Alexander Macklin tends to the small ailments that arise when men live in close quarters under stress. A cut finger, a persistent cough, the inevitable bumps and strains of life aboard a ship locked in ice. His medical kit becomes a symbol of preparedness, of the belief that they will need these bodies, healthy and whole, for whatever comes next. His touch is gentle, professional, but also deeply human. The way he listens not just to symptoms, but to the fears behind them. The way he prescribes not just medicine, but reassurance, the quiet confidence that they will get through this together. The afternoon brings games, cards, chess, checkers, simple diversions that become complex social rituals. Watch the way they play, not with the desperate intensity of men trying to forget their circumstances, but with the easy camaraderie of friends who have time to truly see each other. Frank Worsley, their captain, proves surprisingly skilled at poker. Not because he's particularly clever with cards, but because he's learned to read faces, to understand the subtle tells that reveal more than words. His laughter, when he wins a hand, carries the same joy he once found in navigating by stars. Thomas Audelease organizes impromptu competitions. Who can tie the most knots in a minute? Who can identify the most bird calls from memory? These games might seem trivial, but they serve a deeper purpose. They remind each man of his unique skills, his particular value to the group. They create moments of individual recognition within their collective struggle. The bonds forming between these men, you can see them in the small gestures, the way McNish shares his tobacco without being asked, the way the younger crew members seek out the older ones for stories, for wisdom, for the simple comfort of experience, the way disagreements arise and resolve, not through formal mediation, but through the natural friction and forgiveness of people learning to live together. There's a lesson here for the weight you carry, the way teams, real teams, form not through grand declarations or team-building exercises, but through the accumulated trust of small, repeated kindnesses. The way leadership emerges not from titles, but from the willingness to serve, to notice, to care. As evening approaches, the ship settles into its familiar rhythms. Someone produces a harmonica, and soft melodies drift through the cramped quarters. Not performance, just the human impulse to make something beautiful, to add harmony to their floating world. The music speaks of home, of places left behind, of people waiting. But it also speaks of here, of now, of the strange grace they're discovering in their shared isolation. The notes weave between the ice's constant murmurs, creating a soundtrack for endurance. James Wordie, their geologist, sits by lamplight, carefully cataloguing rock samples collected before the ice claimed them. His notebook fills with precise descriptions, detailed sketches, scientific observations that may never reach another soul. Yet he continues, driven by the deep human need to bear witness, to record, to make meaning from experience. This is what routine becomes when everything else falls away. Not mere habit, but conscious choice. The decision to maintain standards, to honor commitments, to believe in tomorrow by preparing for it today. The weight you carry. It too deserves this kind of attention, not the frantic energy of crisis management, but the steady devotion of craftspeople who understand that excellence lives in the details, in the daily choice to show up fully for what you're building. Outside, the ice continues its ancient conversation. Pressure ridges form and collapse, creating new landscapes overnight. The ship creaks and adjusts, finding its balance in circumstances no designer ever imagined. And inside, 28 men create their own small civilization, their own rhythms of care and purpose. They don't know what tomorrow will bring. They can't control the ice, can't command the weather, can't guarantee their rescue. But they can control this. The quality of attention they bring to each task, the kindness they offer each other, the dignity with which they face uncertainty. This is the deepest lesson of routine. Not that it prevents change, but that it provides continuity through change. Not that it guarantees outcomes, but that it honors the process. Not that it eliminates uncertainty, but that it creates islands of stability in uncertain seas. Let their example settle with you tonight. The way they transformed a trapped ship into a home, strangers into family, crisis into opportunity for grace. The way they proved that leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about creating space for everyone to contribute their piece of the solution. Handschat, Weddell Sea Secrets. The weight you carry often comes with questions that have no immediate answers. What markets will shift tomorrow? Which decisions will prove wise 6 months from now? What challenges lie hidden beneath the surface of what you're building? The men aboard the Endurance knew this feeling intimately. They had sailed into waters that held secrets, mysteries that no human eye had witnessed, no scientific instrument had measured. The Weddell Sea stretched endlessly around their trapped ship, a vast library of unknowns. For months, they had become inadvertent scholars of this frozen world, not by choice, but by circumstance. And in their patient observation, they discovered something profound about the nature of discovery itself. Frank Wild would often stand at the ship's rail in the pale Antarctic twilight, watching the ice for signs of life. The sea beneath seemed barren to the untrained eye, just endless white stretching to the horizon. But Wild had learned to read the subtle signs, the way certain patches of ice held a different color, the mysterious sounds that echoed from below, clicks and calls from creatures no zoologist had ever catalogued. There's an entire world down there, he would tell the younger crew members, a world that's been carrying on its business for thousands of years, completely unaware of our struggles up here. The ship's biologist, Robert Clark, had filled notebook after notebook with observations that would have thrilled the Royal Society if they ever made it back to civilization. Strange fish that seemed to glow with their own inner light, seals with behaviors unlike any recorded in temperate waters. And beneath it all, the constant sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you realize you've ventured into territory with no roadmap, when the conventional wisdom of your industry doesn't quite apply to what you're building, when you're simultaneously excited by the possibilities and sobered by how much you don't yet know. Clark would spend hours at the ship's edge, lowering nets through holes cut in the ice, never knowing what might emerge. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes specimens so unusual he struggled to classify them. The Weddell Sea, he learned, was home to creatures that had adapted to conditions that shouldn't support life at all. Fish with antifreeze proteins in their blood, allowing them to survive in water that would kill their cousins from warmer seas. Invertebrates that grew to enormous sizes in the cold, nutrient-rich depths. An entire ecosystem that operated by rules written nowhere in any textbook. Every day here rewrites what we thought we knew, Clark confided to his journal one evening. The aurora australis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold above him. Another mystery, another reminder of how much remained unexplored. The men had read accounts of previous expeditions, of course. James Weddell himself, the Scottish sealer for whom these waters were named, had sailed these seas nearly a century earlier. In 1823, Weddell had pushed further south than anyone before him, reaching 74 degrees south latitude before the ice forced him back. But Weddell had been there in summer, when the ice retreated and the sea opened like a flower. He had glimpsed this world at its most welcoming, if such a word could ever apply to Antarctic waters. The Endurance crew was experiencing something entirely different. They were witnesses to the sea's winter secrets, the hidden life that flourished when the surface world seemed most dead. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, captured what images he could through the endless polar night. But his cameras couldn't record the sounds that haunted their sleep, the deep groaning of ice under pressure, the distant songs of whales navigating by echolocation through the darkness below. "There are conversations happening down there," Hurley observed, adjusting his equipment with fingers numbed by cold. "Whale songs we can barely hear, seal calls that carry for miles. An entire social network operating beneath our feet." The crew learned to interpret these sounds like a new language. The sharp crack that meant pressure ridges forming miles away. The hollow boom that signaled an iceberg carving from some distant shelf. The subtle splash that meant seals had found breathing holes they hadn't noticed. Each sound told a story of adaptation, of life finding ways to thrive in conditions that would seem impossible. Just as you've learned to read the subtle signals in your own domain, the shift in a client's tone that suggests changing needs, the market indicators that hint at opportunities others haven't spotted yet. Thomas Order-Lees, the motor expert turned storekeeper, became fascinated by the ice itself, not just as an obstacle, but as a living, breathing entity with its own patterns and purposes. He would chip samples from different formations, noting how ice formed under pressure created different crystal structures than ice formed in calm water. "Each piece tells the story of how it was made," he explained to anyone willing to listen. The clear blue ice formed slowly, under pressure. The white, bubbly ice froze quickly when the wind was up. The ice with the green tinge, that's been in contact with algae, with life. He was learning to read the biography of their prison, understanding that even their confinement had layers of meaning, patterns that spoke to forces far larger than their individual struggle. The men discovered that the Weddell Sea operated on timescales that dwarfed human ambition. Ice that trapped them today might have begun forming decades ago in distant waters. Currents that carried their ship followed paths established by the rotation of the Earth itself. Ancient rhythms that would continue long after their names were forgotten. Yet within this vastness, they found intimacy. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, would take readings at the same times each day, building a record of conditions that revealed subtle patterns, temperature variations that predicted weather changes days in advance, barometric pressures that correlated with ice movement in ways no theory had predicted. "The sea is teaching us its language," Hussey noted in his careful script, "but we have to be patient enough to listen." This patience, this willingness to observe without immediately understanding, perhaps this is what separates those who thrive in uncertainty from those who are paralyzed by it. The crew couldn't control their circumstances, but they could deepen their understanding of them. They learned that emperor penguins navigated by stars they couldn't see, following magnetic fields they couldn't feel. That leopard seals, fearsome predators on the surface, were surprisingly social creatures below the ice. That the seemingly barren landscape supported food chains of stunning complexity. Clark's nets brought up creatures that seemed designed by an alien intelligence. Transparent fish with organs visible through their skin. Jellyfish that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms. Crustaceans that built shells from minerals that shouldn't exist at these temperatures. "Every specimen raises more questions than it answers," Clark wrote, "but perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the value isn't in solving mysteries, but in learning to live comfortably with them." The weight of the unknown, they discovered, could be carried with grace when shared among people committed to the same journey. Each man's observations contributed to a collective understanding that none could have achieved alone. Their daily routines became a form of scientific collaboration. Wild's ice watches informed Clark's biological surveys. Hurley's photographs provided context for Hussey's weather data. Order-Lees's ice analysis helped predict where seals might surface for air. They were building something together, not the transcontinental crossing they had originally planned, but something perhaps more valuable: a deep understanding of how life persists in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The Weddell Sea was teaching them that mystery and mastery could coexist, that you could operate effectively in an environment you didn't fully understand, as long as you remained humble enough to keep learning. Tonight, as your own mind processes the unknowns in what you're building, remember their patient example, the way they transformed ignorance into curiosity, uncertainty into investigation, the way they proved that leadership in uncharted territory isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating space for discovery, maintaining the steady rhythms that allow insight to emerge, and trusting that understanding deepens through sustained attention rather than rushed conclusions. Let the mysteries of your own deep waters settle around you, not as burdens to be solved before morning, but as invitations to patient observation, steady progress, and the quiet confidence that comes from learning to read the subtle signs of the world you're navigating. The sea beneath the ice holds its secrets still, but it's shared enough with those patient observers to change how they understood the very nature of survival itself. The ice tightens, and yet, as November deepened into the Antarctic summer that would never truly arrive, the patient observers began to notice something else stirring beneath their floating laboratory. The ice was waking up, not with the gentle stirrings they had grown accustomed to, but with a restless energy that seemed to pulse through the frozen expanse like a slow, massive heartbeat. The sounds came first, deep groans that resonated through the ship's hull in the small hours when most men lay in their bunks, listening. You know these moments, don't you? When the very foundations of what you're building begin to shift beneath you, when the market conditions you've learned to read so carefully, the partnerships you've cultivated, the careful balance of resources and ambition, all start to move in ways that feel beyond your control. Harry McNish felt it in his bones before his trained carpenter's ear could identify the source. The familiar creaking of timber under normal stress was giving way to something else entirely. A sustained pressure that made the ship's wooden ribs sing with tension. He would lie awake, hand pressed against the hull, feeling the ice communicate its intentions through vibrations that traveled up through his palm into his chest, settling somewhere deep in his understanding of how things hold together and how they come apart. The Endurance had been designed for this, her hull shaped like an egg to slip upward when the ice squeezed, her frames reinforced to flex rather than break. But no ship, however cleverly built, was meant to withstand the full embrace of a continent deciding to close its fist. Shackleton felt the change too, though he carried this knowledge differently than his carpenter did. Where McNish absorbed the ship's distress through his craftsman's sensitivity to materials under strain, the boss, as they called him, felt the weight of 27 other minds beginning to register what their bodies already knew. The ice was no longer content to simply hold them. It wanted to reshape them. During the day, when the pale Antarctic sun cast long shadows across their frozen world, the men could still maintain the rhythms they had established. Scientific observations continued. Meals were prepared and shared. The gramophone still played its scratchy melodies in the wardroom. But underneath these familiar activities, a new tension was weaving itself into the fabric of their small civilization. You understand this tension, don't you? The way uncertainty can infiltrate even the most carefully constructed routines. How the weight you carry seems to grow heavier not because more has been added, but because the ground beneath your feet has become less certain. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, began to notice the small signs first. The way conversations would pause mid-sentence when a particularly loud crack echoed through the ship. How men's eyes would dart toward the portholes when the groaning grew sustained. The subtle shift in posture, shoulders held just a fraction higher, jaws set just a degree tighter. These were not men prone to panic. They had signed on for an expedition to the ends of the Earth, had already adapted to months of isolation in one of the planet's most unforgiving environments. But they were also men with enough experience to recognize when the rules of their situation were changing. The ice pressure came in waves, building slowly over hours, then releasing with sharp reports that sounded like rifle shots in the crisp air. Each cycle seemed to probe a different part of the ship's defenses, testing the strength of her construction, The resilience of her design, the limits of what wood and iron could withstand when caught between immovable forces. In the engine room, where the Endurance's heart had fallen silent months ago, when coal became too precious to burn, the sounds were amplified and focused. The ship's engineer would descend into that mechanical cathedral and listen, mapping the stress patterns by ear, tracking how each new pressure point affected the whole. This is the weight that leaders carry, isn't it? This constant listening for the signs that the systems you depend on are approaching their limits, the ability to hear, in the small changes of tone and rhythm, the early warnings of what might come to pass. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about those November days was not the growing pressure, but how the crew adapted to it. They developed new rituals around the sounds, ways of acknowledging the ice's presence without letting it dominate their thoughts. When a particularly loud crack would echo through the ship, someone might pause to listen, then continue their sentence exactly where they had left off. They learned to sleep through the groaning that had once kept them awake, not because they had grown deaf to it, but because they had learned to hear within it the difference between the ship adjusting and the ship failing. Their bodies calibrated themselves to this new normal, finding rest in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. This is what adaptation looks like. Not the dramatic moments of crisis and response that make for compelling stories, but the quiet recalibration of what constitutes normal, the gradual expansion of what you can carry, what you can navigate, what you can build even as the ground shifts beneath you. Shackleton understood that his role was evolving too. The expedition leader who had planned to be first across the Antarctic continent was becoming something else entirely, a shepherd of morale in circumstances no planning could have anticipated. He began to spend more time simply moving through the ship, not checking on specific tasks or addressing particular problems, but maintaining his presence as a steady point of reference. You know this responsibility, the way your own presence becomes a kind of anchor for others when uncertainty grows thick, how your calm becomes their calm, your confidence their confidence, not through grand gestures or stirring speeches, but through the simple consistency of showing up, of remaining steady when everything else is in motion. The ice continued its work, patient and inexorable. What had begun as gentle pressure was becoming something more insistent, more personal. The Endurance would rise and settle as the frozen sea adjusted itself around her, each movement accompanied by the symphony of stressed wood and protesting metal. But within this growing tension, something else was taking shape. The crew was discovering reserves they hadn't known they possessed, not just of physical endurance, but of collective resilience. The very pressure that threatened to crush their ship was forging them into something stronger than the sum of their individual parts. They developed new languages for their situation, ways of communicating about the ice's behavior that were both precise and somehow comforting. They learned to read the patterns, to distinguish between the sounds that required attention and those that were simply part of their new reality. In the galley, where meals continued to appear with remarkable regularity despite their circumstances, the cook learned to time his preparations around the ship's movements. Bread was kneaded during the quiet periods, stews simmered through the gentle rockings, and somehow, impossibly, the rhythm of nourishment continued. This is what you're building, isn't it? Not just the visible structures of success, but these deeper capacities for adaptation, for finding stability within instability, for maintaining the essential work of care and sustenance even when the external conditions seem to argue against hope itself. As November drew toward its close, the ice pressure had become a constant presence, no longer an interruption to their routine, but woven into the very fabric of their days. The men had learned to work with it, to plan around it, to find in its rhythms a strange kind of companionship. They were discovering what you perhaps already know, that the weight you carry can become not just bearable, but somehow integral to who you're becoming, that the pressure that seems designed to break you can instead reveal strengths you never knew you possessed. The Endurance groaned and flexed, rose and settled, held and adjusted, and through it all, 28 men continued the patient work of survival, of community, of maintaining their humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to strip it away. The ice was tightening its grip, but they were learning to breathe within that embrace, to find space for hope, for laughter, for the small acts of care that make any life worth living. Even at the bottom of the world, even when everything familiar has been squeezed away, leaving only what is essential, what is true, what endures, the inevitable. By mid-November, the sounds had changed again. No longer the distant rumbling they had grown accustomed to, but something closer, more intimate, more final. The ship herself was speaking now, in groans that rose from her very bones, in creaks that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the endurance were trying to tell them something important, something they needed to understand. Frank Worsley felt it first in his cabin, a subtle shift in the way his bunk sat against the wall, the way his compass needle trembled with vibrations that had nothing to do with magnetic variation. The ice was no longer content to hold them. It wanted more. In your own work, in what you're building, perhaps you felt this moment approaching, when the pressures you've been managing, the challenges you've been navigating with such careful attention, suddenly shift from manageable to something else entirely, something that demands not just adaptation, but transformation. The men moved through their routines that morning with the particular care of people who sense change in the air. Hurley adjusting his photographic plates with extra precision, McNish running his hands along timber joints he'd checked 100 times before. Each man unconsciously cataloguing, remembering, preparing for something they couldn't yet name. Then the ice spoke with a voice they couldn't ignore. The pressure came not as a sudden blow, but as an inexorable tightening, like a vast hand slowly closing around the ship's hull, testing, probing, finding the places where wood and iron might yield to forces beyond their design. Shackleton stood on deck as the first real crack appeared along the starboard side, a hairline fracture that seemed almost insignificant until you understood what it meant, what it promised, what it made inevitable. He didn't call the men together immediately, didn't sound alarms or issue urgent orders. Instead, he watched and listened and felt the weight of 27 lives settling more fully onto his shoulders. The weight, the weight that comes not from failure, but from responsibility, from being the one who must see clearly when others cannot, who must speak calmly when the world is shifting beneath everyone's feet. The water came slowly at first, seeping through joints that had held firm for months, finding its way into spaces that had remained dry and warm. Cold Antarctic water that carried with it the undeniable message that their floating home, their refuge, their carefully constructed world, was no longer safe. Wild organized the pumping detail with quiet efficiency, men working in shifts to push back the sea, not because they believed they could win this battle, but because the work itself was necessary. The effort itself was what separated them from despair. And in those hours of steady pumping, of bailing, of the rhythmic sound of water being lifted and poured away, there was something almost meditative, almost peaceful. The way there can be peace in accepting what must be done, in doing it well, in facing the inevitable with grace. You know this moment in your own journey, when the structures you've built, the systems you've relied on, the foundations you've trusted, begin to show their limits. When the pressures of growth, of competition, of simply surviving in an uncertain world exceed what your current vessel can bear. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like a recognition, an acknowledgement of what had already been decided by forces larger than any of them, larger than their hopes, larger than their considerable will to endure. "We'll prepare to abandon ship," Shackleton told his officers, not as a defeat, but as the next necessary step, the next adaptation in a long series of adaptations, each one requiring them to let go of something they had thought essential, to discover what truly was. The men received the news with the particular stillness of people who have been expecting it, who have been preparing for it without quite admitting they were preparing, who understand that some battles are won not by fighting, but by choosing when and how to yield, when to conserve strength for the struggles that matter most. They began the careful work of salvaging, of deciding what could be carried and what must be left behind. Each choice a small act of wisdom, a small exercise in understanding the difference between what they wanted and what they needed, between comfort and survival, between the life they had planned and the life they were being called to live. McNish worked with particular focus, selecting tools not for their perfection, but for their versatility, their durability, their ability to serve multiple purposes in circumstances he couldn't yet imagine, the kind of practical wisdom that comes from understanding that everything changes, that adaptability matters more than optimization. The ice continued its relentless work, opening the ship like a slow flower, revealing her inner spaces to the Antarctic air, transforming their home into something else, something that belonged now more to the elements than to them. But even in this dismantling, this careful destruction, there was beauty. The way the low sun caught the ice crystals forming on exposed timbers, the way the men moved with such deliberate care, such attention to each other, such quiet determination to do this difficult thing well. As evening approached and the Endurance settled deeper into her icy embrace, the crew gathered their most essential possessions, their warmest clothes, their most trusted tools, everything else becoming memory, becoming part of a story they would carry forward, lightened now of everything except what mattered most. The weight you carry, the challenges pressing against what you've built, they too are teaching you something about what endures, about what can be released, about the difference between losing everything and discovering what you truly cannot lose. Hanchcard abandoned ship. The final preparations unfold with the same quiet, methodical care that has carried them through these months of waiting. Shackleton moving among his men, watching as they make their last selections, their last decisions about what a human life requires when stripped to its essence. Some choices prove surprisingly easy. The heavy books that once seemed essential, the extra clothing that felt necessary, the tools that promised security but now promise only burden. Other choices cut deeper, personal letters from home, photographs that hold entire worlds, small treasures that anchor identity to something beyond this endless white. You understand this winnowing, this forced clarity that comes when circumstances demand you choose, when the weight of carrying everything becomes impossible, when survival depends on recognizing what truly sustains you versus what merely comforts. In your own moments of pressure, when resources grow thin, when difficult decisions loom, you felt this same sharp focus, this uncomfortable gift of knowing exactly what matters. The carpenter McNish secures his most essential tools, the ones his hands know by touch, the ones that can build shelter, create warmth, fashion hope from raw materials. The cook packs his simplest equipment, understanding that nourishment comes not from elaborate preparation, but from the care with which simple food is shared. The navigator takes his instruments, his charts, the tools that translate stars into direction, uncertainty into progress, each man carrying forward not just objects, but the knowledge of how to use them, the skills that transform mere possessions into possibilities. The Endurance herself settles deeper into her icy cradle, her masts tilting at angles that speak of surrender, her hull embracing the inevitable with a dignity that mirrors her crew. She has carried them as far as she could, sheltered them through the long Antarctic night, provided warmth and community and purpose when the original plan dissolved. Now she offers them one final gift, the lesson of graceful release, of knowing when holding on becomes harder than letting go. The men gather at the rail for their last moments aboard, looking back at spaces that held their hopes, their fears, their growing understanding of what they could endure together. The galley where they shared countless meals, the quarters where they weathered the worst storms, the deck where they watched the ice close around their dreams and discovered something stronger than dreams. They are leaving behind a ship, but carrying forward everything that made them more than passengers, more than survivors, more than men who simply endured. And as they step onto the ice, their salvaged supplies arranged with careful precision, their survival depending now entirely on what they've learned about themselves and each other, they carry with them this quiet knowledge that some things cannot be crushed by pressure, cannot be abandoned, even when everything else must be left behind. The bonds forged in difficulty, the skills earned through challenge, the understanding that what you're building lives not in the structures that contain it, but in the wisdom and resilience and care that you carry forward into whatever comes next.